This is a CBS News Special Report. I'm Norah O'Donnell in El Paso, Texas. President Trump is about to address the nation in the wake of two deadly mass shootings just 13 hours apart, including one right here in El Paso and another in Dayton, Ohio. 29 people were killed in the attacks and more than 50 people were hurt. Now, this morning on Twitter, the president called for change. He tweeted, quote, "We cannot let those killed in El Paso, Texas and Dayton, Ohio die in vain. Republicans and Democrats must come together and get strong background checks, perhaps marrying this legislation with desperately needed immigration reform." It's still not clear what all of that means, but that's why we're waiting to hear more from the president shortly. Weijia Jiang is at the White House this morning. And Weijia, what's your sense? What are you hearing from White House officials about what does the president mean when he says, quote, strong background checks are needed?
Well, they are certainly not going to answer that right now because the president will have to answer that for himself. In fact, aides aren't exactly clear what he means by that until we hear from him, because he has mentioned this in the past. Of course, we know that in the past, Democrats have tried to strengthen those checks before, lengthening the time of review from 3 to 10 days as one example, and requiring those checks for every firearm that is sold. But the president here seems to present a new idea of marrying legislation on gun reform with immigration reform, to extremely complicated, difficult issues that he looks like he wants to marry together. But we should mention, Nora, that this isn't the first time he has made a call for stronger controls like this. In fact, after the shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Florida on Valentine's Day in 2018, he said the same thing. He said that to the parents of the victims inside the White House, that he would be very strong on those checks and that he would consider raising, for example, the legal age limit to purchase semi-automatic weapons from 18 to 21. He specifically mentioned having to do more reviews of people who buy guns, and then that went away. That faded after strong pushback from his party and the NRA. And so he really has to answer here what he means. You mentioned this tweet, but that's all we have, unfortunately, is just a few words that something has to happen. And unfortunately, as we have seen in the past, he was vague. But there are other things that we'll be looking for as the president makes remarks here. Number one, how will he respond to those claims that he is to blame for what happened in El Paso, given what we know about the shooter's motive, given the almost identical language that the gunman used in talking about the crisis at the border with regard to illegal immigration? Number two, how will he characterize this shooting? Because words matter here. And so far, the president has not used words like racism, white supremacy, terrorism to describe this attack, even though we know federal authorities are investigating this as an act of domestic terrorism. We know that lawmakers on both sides have used the words white racism to describe what happened here. We know that his own daughter, Ivanka Trump, who is a very close advisor to the president, even said that white supremacy, like all forms of evil, must be stopped. So it matters how the president classifies this shooting. He has said that this is a result of mental illness. He has said that these are sick people, but he has not used those very words in describing what happened in El Paso. He will also have to talk about the other shooting in Columbus. And again, back to our original point, is what happens now. He will have to tell the country what he plans to do to prevent more attacks in the future. Nora?
All right, Weijia Jiang at the White House, and noting that the president has reneged on previous responses to get tougher on background checks. We should point out it is not yet clear whether any type of stronger background checks would have stopped either the shooters in Dayton, Ohio, or here in El Paso. One important thing to note as well: the FBI has issued an extraordinary statement from its director late last night, in which FBI Director Chris Wray said that he is concerned about a continued continued threat posed by domestic violent extremists and perpetrators of hate crime, even saying that the FBI is worried that people may be inspired by some of these high-profile attacks that have happened. This has also drawn the concern of those on Capitol Hill, Republicans and Democrats. Nancy Cordes is there on Capitol Hill. And Nancy, I know Democrats in the House have tried to pass tougher gun laws just this year, but nothing came of it, right?
That's right. Those bills have stalled here in the Senate. Back in February, Democrats, who now control the House, passed a universal background check bill. It picked up support from 8 House Republicans. And while the president now says that he supports more background checks, the White House is still officially opposed to that legislation. The president has threatened to veto that legislation. The NRA opposes that legislation, arguing that background checks don't work, arguing that the legislation would be too onerous for gun owners. And so while you now have Democrats in the Senate calling on the Senate's Republican leader to bring everyone back in the midst of this 5-week recess, to hold some kind of emergency session to deal with gun violence, it's highly unlikely that that is going to happen, Norah, because the reality is that many Republicans here on Capitol Hill, even though they know that a vast majority of the American public support beefing up background checks, they also worry that this could be a slippery slope, that if you pass a bill addressing background checks, that Democrats will simply want more and more legislation addressing the gun violence problem, addressing gun control, something that many Republicans oppose.
And Nancy, we're just looking at live pictures from inside the diplomatic room where we're expecting the president to speak to the nation shortly. Quick question. The president mentioning this morning that he would try and marry background checks with immigration reform legislation, two things that can't get done on their own. How would they get done together?
That was a really interesting strategic approach, Norah, because typically what you try to do when you need to pass something controversial is marry it to something that's incredibly uncontroversial, that everyone has to support. That's how you get something very difficult over the finish line. The idea that you would take something controversial, marry it to something that is just as controversial, if not more so, that is typically a strategy that we don't see here on Capitol Hill. I suppose the thinking is that you take something that Democrats really want, gun control legislation, and you marry it to something that Republicans really want, immigration controls, and perhaps you've got a winning approach here. But if you talk to Democratic and Republican leaders, they really think that getting something like that over the finish line would be almost impossible. In fact, you don't see much of an effort on the part of Republicans to even try to push comprehensive immigration reform anymore because the politics is so intransigent.
All right, Nancy, let's listen now to the president, joined by the vice president from the diplomatic room.
My fellow Americans, this morning, our nation is overcome with shock, horror, and sorrow. This weekend, more than 80 people were killed or wounded in 2 evil attacks. One Saturday morning in El Paso, Texas, a wicked man went to a Walmart store where families were shopping with their loved ones. He shot and murdered 20 people and injured 26 others, including precious little children. Then, in the early hours of Sunday morning, Dayton, Ohio, another twisted monster opened fire on a crowded downtown street. He murdered 9 people, including his own sister, and injured 27 others. The First Lady and I join all Americans in praying and grieving for the victims, their families, and the survivors. We will stand by their side forever. We will never forget. These barbaric slaughters are an assault upon our communities, an attack upon our nation, and a crime against all of humanity. We are outraged and sickened by this monstrous evil, the cruelty, the hatred, the malice, the bloodshed, and the terror. Our hearts are shattered for every family whose parents, children, husbands, and wives were ripped from their arms and their lives. America weeps for the fallen, We are a loving nation, and our children are entitled to grow up in a just, peaceful, and loving society. Together, we lock arms to shoulder the grief. We ask God in heaven to ease the anguish of those who suffer, and we vow to act with urgent resolve. I want to thank the many law enforcement personnel who responded to these atrocities with the extraordinary grace and courage of American heroes. I have spoken with Texas Governor Greg Abbott and Ohio Governor Mike DeWine, as well as Mayor DeMargo of El Paso, Texas, and Mayor Nan Whaley of Dayton, Ohio, to express our profound sadness and unfailing support. Today, we also send the condolences of our nation to President Obrador of Mexico and all the people of Mexico for the loss of their citizens in the El Paso shooting. Terrible, terrible thing. I have also been in close contact with Attorney General Barr and FBI Director Wray. Federal authorities are on the ground, and I have directed them to provide any and all assistance required, whatever is needed. The shooter in El Paso posted a manifesto online consumed by racist hate. In one voice, our nation must condemn racism, bigotry, and white supremacy. These sinister ideologies must be defeated. Hate has no place in America. Hatred warps the mind, ravages the heart, and devours the soul. We have asked the FBI to identify all further resources they need to investigate and disrupt hate crimes and domestic terrorism, whatever they need. We must recognize that the Internet has provided a dangerous avenue to radicalize disturbed minds and perform demented acts. We must shine light on the dark recesses of the Internet and stop mass murders before they start. The Internet, likewise, is used for human trafficking, illegal drug distribution, and so many other heinous crimes. The perils of the Internet and social media cannot be ignored, and they will not be ignored. In the 2 decades since Columbine, our nation has watched with rising horror and dread as one mass shooting has followed another, over and over again, decade after decade. We cannot allow ourselves to feel powerless. We can and will stop this evil contagion. In that task, we must honor the sacred memory of those we have lost by acting as one people. Open wounds cannot heal if we are divided. We must seek real bipartisan solutions. We have to do that in a bipartisan manner that will truly make America safer and better for all. First, we must do a better job of identifying and acting on early warning signs. I am directing the Department of Justice to work in partnership with local, state, and federal agencies, as well as social media companies, to develop tools that can detect mass shooters before they strike. As an example, the monster in the Parkland High School in Florida had many red flags against him, and yet nobody took decisive action. Nobody did anything. Why not? Second, we must stop the glorification of violence in our society. This includes the gruesome and grisly video games that are now commonplace. It is too easy today for troubled youth to surround themselves with a culture that celebrates violence. We must stop or substantially reduce this, and it has to begin immediately. Cultural change is hard, but each of us can choose to build a culture that celebrates the inherent worth and dignity of every human life. That's what we have to do. Third, we must reform our mental health laws to better identify mentally disturbed individuals who may commit acts of violence and make sure those people not only get treatment, but when necessary, involuntary confinement. Mental illness and hatred pulls the trigger, not the gun. Fourth, we must make sure that those judged to pose a grave risk to public safety do not have access to firearms, and that if they do, those firearms can be taken through rapid due process. That is why I have called for red flag laws, also known as extreme risk protection orders. Today, I'm also directing the Department of Justice to propose legislation ensuring that those who commit hate crimes and mass murders face the death penalty, and that this capital punishment be delivered quickly, decisively, and without years of needless delay. These are just a few of the areas of cooperation that we can pursue. I am open and ready to listen and discuss all ideas that will actually work and make a very big difference. Republicans and Democrats have proven that we can join together in a bipartisan fashion to address this plague. Last year, we enacted the Stop School Violence and Fix NICS Acts into law, providing grants to improve school safety and strengthening critical background checks for firearm purchases. At my direction, the Department of Justice banned bump stocks. Last year, we prosecuted a record number of firearms offenses. But there is so much more that we have to do. Now is the time to set destructive partisanship aside, so destructive, and find the courage to answer hatred with unity, devotion, and love. Our future is in our control. America will rise to the challenge. We will always have, and we always will, win. The choice is ours, and ours alone. It is not up to mentally ill monsters. It is up to us. If we are able to pass great legislation after all of these years, we will ensure that those who were attacked will not have died in vain. May God bless the memory of those who perished in Toledo. And may God protect them. May God protect all of those from Texas to Ohio. May God bless the victims and their families. May God bless America. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Dramatic room inside the White House as reporters try and get in a couple questions to the president. A strong statement condemning these, what he called crimes against all humanity, the cruelty, the hatred, the malice, and saying that America's hearts are shattered and that America weeps for the fallen. Let's bring in Nancy Cordes from Capitol Hill. And while Nancy, the president had in a tweet earlier today said that he would call for stronger background checks, what did you hear in terms of substance?
Well, he really didn't get into what kind of background check legislation he would actually support. And that's something that Democrats were listening for after he kind of opened the door in his tweets this morning. Would he actually reverse his position and support a universal background check bill that passed the House back in February? He didn't appear to do that, but I'm sure that if reporters have a chance to follow up with him and his aides later today, they'll try to get some answers about that. He did express support for so-called red flag laws. These are laws that certain states like Indiana have already enacted, which allow authorities to detain, sometimes up to 2 weeks, individuals who appear to pose an imminent threat to themselves or to others, and to detain their firearms. He appeared to be pushing for a law like that on a national level. That's something that some Republicans have expressed support for this weekend. One thing that a lot of lawmakers were looking for in this this speech is whether he would do something that he has declined to do in the past, pretty notably, and that's denounce white supremacy. And he did at the very top of his speech. He denounced emphatically racism and white supremacy, something that many lawmakers believe is important, but who also feel that it may have come too late. They believe that some of the president's own rhetoric over the past couple of years has normalized the notion of white supremacy in this country. They think he needs to do a lot more, not only to speak out against it, Norah, but also to curtail his own rhetoric.
All right, Nancy Cordes there on Capitol Hill with those important points about legislation. Let's bring in Weijia Jiang at the White House. And Weijia, that phrase in particular, when the president said, in one voice, our nation must condemn racism, bigotry, and white supremacy, that was a step farther than the president has taken in the past.
It really is, Norah. In fact, we had to wait for some time in the past after similar instances. You'll remember in Charlottesville, after a white supremacist rally, violence broke out. And initially, the president said there are very fine people on both sides of the conflict. And after advisors, lawmakers, Americans were in his ear urging him to condemn white supremacy, he did that ultimately. This is different. You're right. He immediately came out and said that this country would not stand for it. He said that they are outraged and sickened by this monstrous evil. And it's important to note he directly mentioned the shooter in El Paso who denounced what he called a Hispanic invasion at the border. Of course, some of that language mirrors how President Trump has talked about the illegal immigration crisis at the border. That's why critics were so quickly to draw the link between what happened in El Paso and how the president has been talking about these migrants before. But in this case, he brought up that shooter. He said these sinister ideologies must be defeated. And he really did set a different tone than he did in the past when it comes to condemning this hate.
All right, Weijia Jiang at the White House. Want to bring in David Begnaud, who is here with me. Today, what is happening here in El Paso in terms of the suspect, the investigation for the families?
We're waiting to see whether or not the suspect appears in court. We're waiting to see if the feds file federal hate crime charges today. We're waiting to see if we get more information about how the domestic terrorism investigation being led by the federal authorities is going to be handled. Here at the scene, nor people continue to show up. It's quiet here. They stand to look, they stand to pray, and they stand to reflect.
Yeah, it's a community still in mourning. David Begnaud, thank you so much. And our coverage will continue on our 24-hour streaming service, CBSN. You can watch it at cbsnews.com or on our CBS News app.